huge amount of ATP is needed to power the contraction cycle. I mean, just think back. We've got to have ATP to cock the myosin head and also to release it from the actin binding sites. And we've got to have ATP to power the pumps that remove calcium from the sarcoplasm back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So there's a lot of ATP needed for muscle contraction. However, the ATP present inside the muscle fibers is enough to power contraction just for a few seconds. If muscle contractions are going to continue for any length of time, the muscle fibers are going to have to be able to make more ATP. Muscle fibers have three primary pathways for generating ATP: direct phosphorylation, anaerobic glycolysis, and aerobic respiration. When muscle fibers are relaxed, they produce more ATP than they need just for resting metabolism. Most of the excess ATP is going to be used to synthesize or to make a molecule known as creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is 3 to 6 times more plentiful than ATP in the sarcoplasm of a relaxed muscle cell. It's not using a lot of energy, so why not store some, right? So when contraction begins and the ADP level starts to rise in the muscle cell, there's an enzyme called creatine phosphate that catalyzes the transfer of a high-energy phosphate from creatine back to ADP. Now think about what's happening here. We've got creatine phosphate storing extra phosphates. When ADP levels raise, that means we're using some ATP, right? Then there's an enzyme, creatine phosphate. It's going to basically snag that phosphate from creatine phosphate, add it to ADP, and bam, we've created ATP. So this direct phosphorylation reaction quickly generates new ATP molecules. Since the formation of ATP from creatine phosphate occurs really quickly, the creatine phosphate's the first source of energy when muscles begin to contract. So between the creatine phosphate and the ATP, muscle cells typically have enough energy stored for muscles to contract at their maximal contraction for only about a total of 15 seconds. After that point, if muscle activity continues, the supply of creatine phosphate and the ATP stored in the muscles depleted, then glucose has to be catabolized or changed from glucose into ATP molecules in the action that we called glycolysis. If you think back when we first studied cell respiration back in Unit 1, we were talking about making ATP. So glycolysis is the first of that cell respiration pathway. And remember, glycolysis occurs in the cytosol where it converts glucose into pyruvic acid. Okay? Once that pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria, it undergoes a whole series of reactions that we called aerobic respiration. Aerobic respiration, remember, includes the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. So those are able to make a large amount of ATP. So during heavy exercise, not enough oxygen may be available to skeletal muscle fibers. So during these anaerobic conditions, when we make that pyruvic acid in glycolysis, it's going to be converted to lactic acid. All right, so let's pause here for a minute. We're breaking glucose down in the action known as glycolysis in the cytosol, so outside of the mitochondria. When there's plenty of oxygen present, this pyruvic acid is going to go into the mitochondria and we're going to make lots and lots of ATP. If there's not sufficient oxygen present, okay, so we're doing lots and lots of exercise, we're in anaerobic low oxygen conditions, then pyruvic acid is going to be converted into lactic acid. Lactic acid is what is thought to cause muscles to fatigue and to become sore. So we only create 2 ATPs during glycolysis, so just a tiny little bit of energy created there. So anaerobic glycolysis produces few ATPs, but it is really fast, and it can occur when oxygen levels are low. So anaerobic glycolysis produces enough energy for about 2 minutes of maximal activity. However, if we really want to create a lot of ATP and there's sufficient oxygen present, that pyruvic acid that we formed in glycolysis is going to enter the mitochondria where it begins that step of reactions known as anaerobic respiration, Krebs cycle, and electron transport chain. Now, glucose, remember, in glycolysis gets converted to pyruvic acid. If there's plenty of oxygen present, the pyruvic acid enters the mitochondria, where we produce somewhere between 30 to 32, 34 more ATPs, water, and CO2. Now, that's when we take sugar, we take glucose and enter this whole pathway. We can also use fatty acids and amino acids to provide the same fuel source. They just enter the mitochondria differently than the glucose does. So aerobic respiration is slower than anaerobic glycolysis, but it makes a whole lot more ATP. Aerobic respiration supplies enough ATP for muscles during periods of light rest or moderate activity, but we've got to have plenty of oxygen and nutrients available. In activities that last from several minutes to an hour or more, aerobic respiration produces most of the ATP that's going to be needed. So here gives you a nice little look at all of the different ways that we create energy. Remember, the direct phosphorylation is simply snagging a phosphate from the creatine and adding it to an ADP to create ATP. So quick energy doesn't last long. Anaerobic respiration includes glycolysis, so we take glucose in the cytosol, we break it down to pyruvic acids. When there's low oxygen present, we've only created a couple of ATP and we release that lactic acid in the blood. That causes our muscles to fatigue. So just a few, maybe a minute or 2 minutes, not a whole lot more worth of energy, aka ATP, has been produced. But when we do need more ATP and we've got plenty of oxygen present, that pyruvic acid doesn't get converted to lactic acid. It instead enters the mitochondria, where we undergo aerobic respiration with that pyruvic molecule, and we create lots and lots of ATP. All right, so another little summary here giving you an idea of how we use this energy. So direct phosphorylation, remember, was quick but not a lot of endurance. So we use a lot of direct phosphorylation, the conversion of creatine phosphate to ATP, in those surge activities where you have a quick surge of movement and then you stop. So weightlifting, diving, sprinting, all very short-lived activities. Anaerobic glycolysis for those on and off bursts. So think about when you're playing soccer or tennis, or you're running a short race. You're working really hard for a short period of time, and then you stop and rest for a few seconds before you go again for a short period of time. So we're able to use glycolysis to make enough energy for some of those activities. But those prolonged activities that require endurance, such as running a marathon or jogging or biking or something that's going to keep you burning that ATP, using that energy for a long period of time, requires that we take those glucose molecules, convert them to pyruvic acid in glycolysis, and then enter the cell respiration cycle so that we can make lots and lots of ATP. And a final note here on using energy in muscles. As muscle tissue contracts, it produces heat, and that's a process we call thermogenesis. So much of the heat that's generated by muscles is used to maintain normal body temperature. So when you're cold, you shiver. That's involuntary muscle contractions, and that increases the rate that we're using that ATP. And as we're using that ATP, the energy is released in the form of heat. So here you can see a little mouse that had a thermogenic study done on it prior to exercising here. The green and yellow areas are the cooler areas of the body. And then after exercise and even more exercise, you see there's less and less of the green, more and more of the red and yellow, indicating heat in the production or as we're using that ATP contracting those muscles. All right, so the body helps us to prevent heat buildup by sweating. So when you're sweating, you are releasing heat in the fluids of the body that are coming out through the sweat glands, because that excess heat is carried in your blood. The blood vessels dilate. Some of that heat radiates out from the body and also is released in the sweat.